Luca Bryce had never imagined that his life would take such a turn when he agreed to move into the small house left to him by his late uncle. The property sat on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by trimmed hedges and rows of carefully maintained driveways, the kind of place where people waved politely to one another but rarely lingered long enough to hold a conversation. To Luca, who had spent most of his adult years working in the state's cartographic office where he specialized in land surveys and outdated boundary records, the inheritance seemed less like a gift and more like a responsibility. His uncle had not been close with the family, and Luca had only vague memories of visiting him as a child. But there was something about stepping onto the cracked pavement of the driveway that gave him an odd sense of continuity, as if he were being handed a puzzle with missing pieces that he alone was expected to solve. The house itself was modest, with faded shutters and ivy crawling along one wall, and the garage door groaned when it opened, revealing stacks of boxes filled with yellowing maps, ledgers, and notebooks. Luca felt a kind of professional curiosity more than nostalgia as he sorted through them during his first week, seeing in the mess a reflection of his uncle's stubborn insistence on documenting every small change to the neighborhood, as if he had been preparing for some unseen battle over lines and numbers on a page. It did not take long for Luca to realize that the driveway, which he had assumed was just a narrow strip leading from the street to the garage, was far more contested than he would have believed possible. On the very first evening after moving in, as he parked his car near the edge of his lot, a woman in her late 50s approached him with a purposeful stride. She wore her hair in a tight bun and carried herself with the air of someone who had long ago decided that she was the authority on everything within view. Her name was Karen Lowry, and she introduced herself not with the warmth of a neighbor, but with the clipped tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She pointed at the way his tires touched the faint line of gravel separating his driveway from hers and said, almost as if delivering a warning rather than a casual remark, that he needed to make sure he did not block access to her property. Luca, slightly confused, explained that he had parked entirely within the paved strip that belonged to his lot, but she shook her head with a tight smile and replied that he would soon learn how things worked here. He let the encounter pass, unwilling to escalate what he hoped was just a quirk of an overbearing neighbor, yet her words lingered with a weight he could not dismiss. As days turned into weeks, Luca began to sense a peculiar tension in the way the neighborhood seemed arranged. His driveway appeared unusually narrow compared to others on the street, as though it had been carved out of an older parcel and left without the proper alignment. The garage belonging to Karen jutted awkwardly forward, its brickwork misaligned with the rest of her house, almost as if it had been added hastily without much regard for where the boundary truly lay. Each time Luca pulled in or out, he noticed how her wall pressed close, casting a shadow over the edge of his pavement, and he wondered why his uncle had never mentioned this intrusion. Neighbors glanced curiously when Luca worked outside, their expressions unreadable, and though they waved politely, none offered more than a few words of small talk, as if they preferred to keep a distance from whatever invisible fault line seemed to run between his property and Karen's. The unease grew when Luca discovered among his uncle's papers several letters addressed to the county registrar, all dated more than a decade earlier, raising concerns about encroachment and unauthorized construction. None of the letters had replies attached, and Luca could not tell whether they had ever been sent or simply drafted and left unsent, but the language suggested that his uncle had been in a long-standing conflict with someone about the precise placement of a structure. Luca felt a stir of recognition. The issue of misaligned records, misplaced deeds, and vanished survey maps was exactly the kind of bureaucratic quagmire he had spent years untangling for others in his professional life. Now, it seemed, he had inherited not just a house but also the unresolved battle that came with it. He remembered Karen's sharp words on that first evening, her insistence that he would learn how things worked, and realized that she had likely been at the center of his uncle's troubles all along. Still, Luca tried to maintain a quiet routine, telling himself that there was no need to invite hostility where there might only be misunderstandings. He worked long hours in his office downtown, often returning after dark, and spent weekends slowly repairing the house's peeling paint and loose shutters. But every time he parked his car in the driveway, he felt her presence from the other side of the thin strip of land, as if Karen's gaze was fixed on whether his tires dared to inch too close to what she believed was hers. He had dealt with property disputes before, seen people transform from mild-mannered professionals into ruthless adversaries over a matter of inches on a boundary map. Yet it was different when the conflict landed not on paper, but at the threshold of his own home. The driveway was supposed to be his, a simple extension of the property he now owned, but already it felt contested, fragile, like a stage upon which an old drama was waiting to be replayed. And though he could not yet see its shape, Luca sensed that the real battle was only beginning. The first true crack in Luca's uneasy attempt at neighborly tolerance appeared on a cool autumn morning when he walked out to his car and found a bright orange envelope tucked under the windshield wiper, its bold capital letters screaming, "Notice of violation." At first, he thought it was some sort of city parking ticket mistakenly issued in his own driveway. But the letterhead revealed it had come not from the municipality, but from a law firm representing Karen Lowry, his next-door neighbor. The wording was blunt and accusatory. Luca was being charged with repeated instances of trespassing and unauthorized parking on what the document described as the legally recognized property of Missy C. Lowry. His alleged offenses were listed with exaggerated precision, dates and times when his vehicle had supposedly crossed the boundary, obstructing Karen's garage access and infringing on her rightful use of her land. The demand at the end was even more jarring. He was to immediately cease parking in the disputed area, compensate her for damages, and attend a court hearing scheduled within a month. Luca stood in the driveway, letter trembling slightly in his hands, and felt a slow burn of disbelief rise inside him. This was not a casual neighbor's quarrel over a misplaced trash can or a hedge that grew a little too far across a line. This was an official legal maneuver, deliberate and forceful, and it carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how to twist a situation into something larger than life. He reread the accusations, knowing they were fabricated, but the confidence with which they were presented unsettled him. His training as a cartographer had taught him that maps and boundaries were never static. Lines shifted through errors, omissions, or manipulations, and the person who controlled the record often controlled reality. Looking at Karen's letter, he realized she was playing precisely that game, transforming a strip of pavement into contested territory simply by stating it loudly and formally enough that the system would be forced to treat it as fact until disproven. When Luca went to the county records office later that day, hoping to retrieve the original property documents that would once and for all silence the absurd claim, he encountered a problem that made his stomach drop. The clerk tapped at her keyboard, frowned at the screen, and then shook her head in mild confusion. According to the digital registry, the lot Luca had inherited appeared strangely truncated. The official boundary line stopped several feet short of where his driveway began, leaving the narrow strip of asphalt in an ambiguous limbo that the system attributed to adjacent property ownership. In plain terms, the county's map now suggested that the very place where Luca parked every day might indeed belong to Karen. He protested, producing his uncle's faded deed and pointing to the descriptions, but the clerk could only shrug, saying that the digitized records had been updated more than a decade earlier during a neighborhood reassessment. Paper archives might hold older versions, she suggested, but those were buried in storage and not immediately accessible. Walking out of the building with a stack of photocopied forms that offered no comfort, Luca felt the invisible weight of Karen's maneuver pressing down on him. He could almost picture her sitting smugly in her kitchen, knowing that the battle was not about who was right but about who had the patience and resources to endure the grinding machine of bureaucracy. She had already tilted the playing field by filing first, by putting him in the position of defendant rather than complainant, and by embedding her claims into the official channels where the burden now rested on him to untangle the mess. For the first time, he began to understand why his uncle's letters had gone unanswered, why a man meticulous enough to document every measurement might still have lost ground to a neighbor who knew how to exploit silence and delay. That evening, as Luca reread the violation notice at his kitchen table, he noticed a small detail that unsettled him further. The letter did not merely accuse him of trespassing. It referenced historical boundary recognition and cited an obscure local ordinance about property lines established by long-standing usage. It was a doctrine Luca had encountered in theory but never seen weaponized so personally. If a neighbor had openly used a piece of land for a sufficient number of years without dispute, they could claim legal rights to it under the principle of adverse possession. It dawned on him that Karen's garage, which pressed aggressively against his driveway, was not an accident of construction, but a calculated anchor, a way of cementing her presence on land she must have known was never hers. By suing him now, she was not just protecting her encroachment, she was attempting to transform it into recognized ownership. The following week brought an even stranger twist. Luca received a thin envelope in the mail, this time from the neighborhood association, which until then had remained invisible in his life. The letter, written in the same officious tone, acknowledged a complaint filed by Ms. Lowry, and informed him that until the matter was resolved, he was strongly advised to avoid parking anywhere near the disputed section of driveway to prevent community disruption. Luca almost laughed at the absurdity of it, except that laughter quickly gave way to a creeping sense of isolation. The association had taken her side without even asking for his. When he walked outside later that evening, he noticed Karen watching him from her porch, her arms folded, expression calm and assured, as if she already knew he was being cornered from every direction. In the nights that followed, Luca struggled with an insistent unease. He dreamt of boundaries shifting like sand under his feet, of driveways rearranging themselves into labyrinths, of his uncle's voice whispering warnings he could not quite understand. During the day, he pored over old survey maps, tracing faint lines that seemed to vanish into nothing, searching for the missing evidence that would restore his claim. Yet, with every discovery came a deeper frustration. The older records existed, but they had been marginalized by newer digital updates that gave Karen's narrative a veneer of legitimacy. He could prove the truth eventually, but not quickly, and in the meantime the lawsuit loomed like a storm cloud threatening to burst. The catalyst had been set in motion, and there was no retreat. Luca was no longer simply the heir to a modest house on a quiet street. He had been cast, unwillingly but decisively, into a battle where the terrain was not just asphalt and brick, but memory, bureaucracy, and manipulation. Karen had drawn the first line, and, with the county's records twisted to her advantage, she had managed to make the absurd look almost plausible. Luca knew that from this point forward, every move would matter, and every delay would cost him ground. The driveway where he had parked so casually weeks earlier was no longer a strip of pavement. It had become a battlefield, and the war had only just begun. The first hearing was scheduled sooner than Luca expected. A brisk morning when the courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, the corridors filled with the shuffle of feet and the murmur of half-whispered conversations. He sat on the wooden bench outside the assigned courtroom, holding a folder of documents he had pulled together in haste. His uncle's deed, photocopies of survey maps, even photographs of the house and driveway taken decades ago. He had combed through the archives in the dim basement of the county records office, where shelves of neglected boxes yielded faded blueprints and handwritten notations, and though the papers were fragile and sometimes incomplete, they told a story. That was clear to him. The driveway had always been part of the property he inherited. It was not a vague easement or a borrowed strip of land, but a defined boundary, and his uncle's meticulous records confirmed as much. Yet, as he sat there, waiting for his name to be called, he could not shake the sense that his evidence, though rational, might be swallowed by the sheer force of Karen's confidence and the bureaucratic indifference of those meant to arbitrate. When the case was called, Luca rose and entered the courtroom, where Karen sat at the plaintiff's table in a neatly pressed suit that made her look more like a seasoned professional than a suburban neighbor. Her lawyer, a man with the kind of polished demeanor that came from years of routine litigation, spoke first, presenting her claim with a practiced rhythm that made even the most absurd assertions sound plausible. He described how Karen had maintained uninterrupted use of her property lines for more than 2 decades, how Luca's car had repeatedly intruded upon her legal right-of-way, and how the garage in question had been constructed in accordance with community standards. The words flowed like a script, carefully measured, leaving Luca with the impression that the truth mattered less than the performance. When it was his turn, Luca stood with a tightness in his chest and presented his documents to the judge, explaining as clearly as he could the inconsistencies in the record. He pointed out the survey maps, the older deeds, and the photographs showing that Karen's garage had once stood several feet back from where it now loomed. He explained his background in cartography, his professional familiarity with shifting records, and his conviction that what had happened here was a simple but devastating error compounded by deliberate opportunism. The judge listened politely, occasionally nodding, but asked few questions. When Karen's lawyer objected to Luca's reliance on informal records rather than certified documents, the objection was sustained, and Luca felt the air leave his lungs. The hearing ended with no resolution, the judge scheduling a continuation pending further review, but Karen emerged with the advantage. As Luca left the courtroom, she passed him in the hallway, her expression calm and almost amused. She leaned in just enough for him to hear and said, "You're wasting your time. This was settled years ago." Her words struck him harder than the ruling, for they hinted at a hidden history, some arrangement or manipulation that had already locked the outcome long before he stepped into the building. Returning home that evening, Luca found a new development waiting for him. A temporary wooden barrier had been erected at the edge of his driveway, painted in bright white with a sign declaring, "Private property, no parking." The structure blocked his car's usual place, forcing him to squeeze into the narrow space near the street. He knew instantly that it was Karen's doing, but when he called the police to report it, the officer who arrived only shrugged and said it was a civil matter. The officer's disinterest, his weary expression suggesting that this was not the first time he had dealt with neighborhood disputes spiraling into absurdity, left Luca with the hollow realization that official channels would not protect him. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Small provocations appeared daily, none large enough to warrant decisive intervention but together forming a constant siege. His mailbox was occasionally left open, rain soaking the letters inside. Garbage bins he set at the curb were mysteriously overturned, their contents scattered across the driveway. A delivery truck once found access blocked by Karen's car, parked deliberately across the entrance, and by the time Luca returned from work, the package had been marked as undeliverable. Each incident seemed trivial when isolated, yet together they eroded his peace, making the house feel less like an inheritance and more like a trap. Luca tried to remain calm, telling himself that patience and evidence would prevail, but the sense of isolation grew heavier with each day. Neighbors, once casually polite, now avoided conversation, as if aligning themselves silently with Karen or simply unwilling to risk being drawn into the conflict. The neighborhood association sent another letter, this time reminding him to respect community harmony and warning that further disruptions could result in fines. It was as though an invisible net had been cast around him, tightening with every move he made. One night, unable to sleep, Luca spread his uncle's papers across the kitchen table once more, tracing the boundaries with his finger, comparing each map and notation, and searching for the thread that would untangle the knot. That was when he noticed a faint annotation on one of the older surveys, a handwritten mark pointing toward the edge of the driveway with the words, "Encroachment begins here," scribbled in his uncle's sharp script. The note was dated 15 years earlier, the same period when the county's digital records had been updated. It struck Luca with sudden clarity. His uncle had seen what was happening but had been powerless to stop it, his warnings ignored until the system itself recorded Karen's version as fact. The realization filled Luca with both grief and anger, for it meant that the battle he now faced was not only his but a continuation of a struggle his uncle had fought in silence. With this new piece of evidence, Luca resolved to push back harder, to bring in independent experts if necessary, to challenge the corrupted records that Karen had turned into her weapon. But, as he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, exhausted yet determined, he knew that escalation was inevitable. Karen had already declared war, and the first skirmishes had shown her willingness to twist every tool of bureaucracy and community pressure to her advantage. The driveway was no longer merely a strip of pavement. It was a contested frontier, and Luca understood that the conflict was about to move beyond paper and into the very fabric of his daily life. By the time the midpoint of the case arrived, Luca had already grown accustomed to the constant pressure of Karen's presence, the quiet hostility of the neighborhood, and the unsettling awareness that the very ground beneath his feet was contested in a way that made each step feel provisional, as though his own home had become a borrowed space he might lose at any moment. The legal process crawled forward with a slowness that left ample room for manipulation, and Karen filled every pause with calculated moves that unsettled him further. She produced photocopies of maps marked with boundaries that appeared subtly different from those in his possession, each stamped with the county's seal, and though Luca recognized the distortions as products of the flawed digital updates, their official appearance made them difficult to dismiss outright. She spoke in hearings with the ease of someone who had rehearsed every line, leaning heavily on the notion of long-standing use, portraying herself as the victim of a young outsider attempting to rewrite the past. The more she leaned into this narrative, the more Luca understood that he was not merely fighting for his driveway, but for the truth of his uncle's history, for the preservation of a record that had been deliberately buried. The turning point came when Luca stumbled across a fragile folder buried at the bottom of one of his uncle's storage boxes, a folder so worn its edges had turned to dust. Inside were letters that had never been mailed, drafts filled with corrections, addressed to the county commission, the neighborhood association, even to state offices. They described in painful detail how Karen had extended her garage in deliberate violation of the agreed boundary, how complaints had been filed but mysteriously gone unanswered, and how contractors had been seen working late at night to pour concrete while inspectors looked the other way. One letter in particular stood out. His uncle had noted that he believed the boundary was erased from the maps on purpose, an assertion Luca had until then considered only as his own suspicion. Reading those words, written in the trembling hand of a man already worn down by the futility of his struggle, Luca felt a shiver run through him. It was as though his uncle had left him a message, not just a warning but a charge to continue where he had failed. The discovery galvanized him. He reached out to a retired county surveyor he had once met during a project years earlier, a man named Howard who lived several towns away and had a reputation for blunt honesty. When Luca explained the situation and showed him the documents, Howard frowned, muttered that he had seen too many maps get cleaned up for convenience, and agreed to conduct a private survey of the property. For several long afternoons, Luca watched as the old man set up his equipment, marked points with colored flags, and scribbled notes with the meticulousness of someone who still believed in the sanctity of a line properly drawn. When he finished, his conclusion was unequivocal. The garage overlapped Luca's property by nearly 6 feet, and the driveway fell entirely within the legal boundaries of the inherited lot. Howard signed his findings, not as an official county document but as an independent professional statement, which Luca knew could carry significant weight in court. When Karen caught sight of the flags dotting the edge of the driveway, her composure cracked for the first time. She approached Luca that evening with a smile stretched too thin, her voice falsely sweet as she asked whether he was planning a renovation. He answered with calm finality that the flags marked the truth of the boundary. Her smile faltered, and though she said nothing further, The sharpness in her eyes conveyed a message more cutting than words. She understood that he had gained ground, and she would not let it stand unchallenged. The next hearing brought the conflict to its public climax. Karen presented her evidence as usual, bringing forward a map so smudged and faded it looked like it had been pulled from an attic, claiming it showed the original placement of the garage. Her lawyer spoke with the same polished assurance, weaving a narrative of a widow who had maintained her home for decades only to be harassed by a newcomer. But this time, Luca was ready. He presented Howard's survey, laid out his uncle's annotated letters, and produced the photographs from the old magazine proof he had discovered in the local print shop. A photo clearly showing Karen's property years after she claimed her garage had been built with the structure absent. The room shifted palpably as the judge studied the material. For the first time, Karen's narrative did not flow unbroken. There were fissures, points of doubt, shadows of deliberate manipulation. After the session ended, Luca felt a cautious surge of relief, but the moment was not purely triumphant. Outside the courthouse, Karen walked up to him with slow precision, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You think a few papers will save you?" she whispered. "I've lived here longer than you've been alive. People trust me. They'll keep trusting me, no matter what lines you draw." The threat was not of physical violence but of social suffocation, the kind of pressure that could erode a person's sanity long before a judge rendered a final verdict. Luca said nothing, only met her gaze with a steadiness he forced himself to hold. But inside, he felt the chill of her words settling like frost across his resolve. In the weeks that followed, her tactics grew stranger, as if she had been rattled by the courtroom shift and sought to regain her dominance through psychological means. At night, motion lights on her property blazed into his windows, flooding his rooms with unwanted brightness. Mysterious chalk marks appeared on the edge of his driveway, circles and arrows pointing in nonsensical directions, which vanished by morning as though to make him question whether he had seen them at all. Once he returned home to find a dead shrub placed squarely in the center of his pavement, an act too deliberate to be random yet too petty to be formally challenged. The accumulation of these gestures wore on him, not because of their scale but because of their intent, to remind him that his fight, though fortified by evidence, would never be clean or simple, that his opponent would never rest so long as she believed she could make him yield through attrition. Yet, despite the erosion of comfort, Luca felt a subtle transformation in himself. Each act of intimidation no longer filled him with the same paralysis it once had. Instead, they sharpened his focus, turning his anger into a kind of steel. He knew the midpoint had shifted the balance. He now possessed evidence that could not be easily dismissed, testimony that corroborated his suspicion, and a renewed sense of connection to his uncle's struggle. What Karen had underestimated was not just his endurance but his professional training, his ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, to follow faint lines until they revealed a hidden structure. The driveway had become more than contested ground. It had become a test of his identity, of whether he would submit to the rewriting of truth or insist on holding the line, even when every pressure around him urged surrender. And in that realization, Luca recognized that the battle was no longer about survival, but about reclaiming the very principle of what was rightfully his. The weeks following the midpoint hearing unfolded like a tightening vice, each day pressing harder against Luca's patience and resolve, as if Karen had decided that if she could not silence him with documents and carefully rehearsed courtroom performances, she would instead erode him through the relentless grind of everyday hostility. The first sign of this shift appeared one morning when he stepped outside to find a formal notice nailed to a wooden stake at the edge of his driveway, declaring in bold letters that he was under investigation for unauthorized property alterations. The accusation was absurd, yet the letter bore the logo of the neighborhood association and included language that suggested fines would follow if he did not immediately cease unpermitted modifications. Luca realized instantly that this was Karen's doing, another maneuver to paint him as the aggressor and to harness the machinery of bureaucracy as her weapon. Yet the very existence of the notice made his stomach clench with dread, because he knew the association could impose penalties, regardless of how baseless the claim might be. Not long after, more subtle pressures followed. Garbage collectors began leaving his bins untouched, forcing him to haul weeks of refuse to a disposal site on his own. A water bill arrived inflated with unexplained surcharges, and when he called the utility company to question it, the representative casually mentioned that a complaint had been filed regarding suspected leaks on his property. Even his mail grew unreliable, with envelopes arriving torn or delayed. None of these issues could be directly traced to Karen, but the pattern was unmistakable. He was being surrounded, suffocated not by one overwhelming blow, but by a constellation of small, persistent strikes meant to convince him that resistance was futile. What unsettled Luca most was not simply the inconvenience, but the realization that Karen had allies, whether complicit or simply misled. At the next neighborhood association meeting, which he attended reluctantly after receiving yet another curt reminder that attendance was encouraged for all members under review, he found himself the object of a roomful of wary stares. Karen sat at the front, speaking smoothly about the need to preserve the harmony and trust of the community, hinting at the dangers of outsiders disrupting long-standing arrangements, never once naming him, but leaving no doubt as to the target of her rhetoric. When he tried to speak in his defense, the chair cut him off with polite but firm reminders to respect time limits, and by the end of the evening, he left with the hollow certainty that the room had been primed against him long before he opened his mouth. It was around this time that Luca noticed how his sleep began to fracture. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the faint glow of Karen's security lights blazing into his windows, his mind running in circles around every possible outcome. Sometimes he imagined the garage looming closer by the day, as though its brick walls inched forward each time he closed his eyes, consuming more of his driveway until nothing remained. He tried to ground himself in work, in the precision of maps and surveys that had once been his refuge, but even there, lines blurred and boundaries shifted, until he felt that reality itself was conspiring to remind him of how fragile his claim truly was. Determined not to be crushed by attrition, Luca sought allies of his own. He contacted the retired surveyor Howard again and asked if he would be willing to testify formally in court, not merely as a private consultant, but as an expert witness. Howard hesitated, warning Luca that such a step would invite scrutiny and hostility, but eventually agreed, saying only that truth has to count for something, even if people don't want to hear it. Encouraged by this, Luca also reached out to the county archives and insisted on a deeper search for older records, pressing beyond the standard channels into the long-neglected storage rooms where paper files lay in dust. His persistence paid off when an archivist unearthed a parcel description from 40 years earlier, one that clearly delineated the driveway as part of the property Luca now owned. The document was yellowed, brittle at the edges, and lacked the sleek authority of the modern digital registry, but it was stamped and signed by the county, and in that authenticity lay its undeniable weight. When Karen caught wind of his renewed push, her tactics escalated from pressure to open provocation. One evening, Luca returned home to find the driveway blocked entirely by a row of heavy planters filled with soil and dead flowers, placed neatly across the pavement so that his car could not pass. He confronted her directly, demanding their removal, but she only smiled and replied that they stood on her land, and that she would happily provide photographs to prove his harassment should he attempt to move them. For a moment, Luca considered dragging the planters away himself, but he stopped, sensing that this was precisely the trap she wanted, to bait him into an act that could be framed as vandalism. Instead, he documented everything with meticulous notes and quietly arranged for Howard to photograph the scene as further evidence of encroachment. The tension reached its breaking point during the next pre-trial session, when Karen's lawyer filed a motion accusing Luca of creating a hostile environment, and requested a restraining order to prevent him from approaching her property. The motion was outrageous, yet it forced Luca to sit through hours of arguments that painted him as a dangerous agitator rather than a beleaguered homeowner. Though the judge declined to issue the order, the fact that it had been entertained at all underscored how effectively Karen had twisted the narrative. Walking out of the courthouse that day, Luca felt the deep exhaustion of someone who understood that victory would not come quickly, that each small gain would be met with equal or greater resistance, and that Karen's true weapon was not her garage or her claims but her capacity to grind him down until he abandoned the fight. But abandoning the fight was not an option. The escalation had clarified something inside him. This was not only about his driveway but about the principle of ownership, of refusing to let manufactured lies overwrite the truth preserved in fragile papers and fading memories. His uncle's struggle had ended in silence, buried under the weight of apathy and manipulation, but Luca would not repeat that fate. The battle was harsher now, the assaults more personal, but they had also hardened his resolve. If Karen wanted to turn his life into a siege, then he would meet her not as a victim, but as an opponent unwilling to cede a single inch of ground, because he understood now that the only way to survive her war of attrition was to outlast her. Line by line, document by document, and inch by contested inch of the pavement that still belonged to him. The courtroom was colder than usual on the day of the final hearing, or perhaps it only felt that way to Luca as he sat at the defendant's table with his folder of documents neatly stacked in front of him, every page carefully ordered, every map and photograph placed with the precision of someone who knew this would be his only chance to cut through the fog of manipulation that had shrouded the case for months. The air was tense with a quiet hum of anticipation, for by now the dispute had drawn more attention than a simple neighborhood quarrel typically would, and several observers had come not out of duty but curiosity, wanting to see how a conflict so seemingly small could have escalated into a trial that tested the very fabric of property law in their county. Across the room, Karen sat with her lawyer, her face a mask of calm determination, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though she had been rehearsing for this moment all her life. Her lawyer spoke first, as he always did, with the smooth cadence of a man used to persuading by rhythm as much as by logic. He presented maps that had been stamped by the county registry, repeated the mantra of long-standing use, and called upon a neighbor who claimed to have always believed the garage sat properly within Karen's boundaries. The testimony was rehearsed, polished, delivered with the confident assurance that the repetition of a lie over enough years might make it feel like truth. Luca listened in silence, steadying his breath, his eyes fixed on the judge who scribbled notes with no sign of reaction, giving nothing away. When his turn came, Luca stood and began not with the papers but with the story. He described the history of the property, his uncle's meticulous records, the unanswered letters, the night construction, and the inexplicable erasure of the driveway from the digital maps. He explained his own background, his professional knowledge of boundaries and surveys, and then he laid out his evidence piece by piece, beginning with Howard's independent survey, followed by the fragile archival parcel description, and finally the proof photograph from the unpublished magazine article, the image that showed with undeniable clarity that Karen's garage had not even existed during the period when she claimed it had already stood. Each piece landed with the slow weight of stone, building not just a case but a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Karen's lawyer tried to object, dismissing the photograph as unofficial and the survey as biased, but the judge allowed the submissions, noting that their relevance outweighed the objections. It was then that Luca placed the final document on the table, his uncle's handwritten annotation declaring where the encroachment began, dated 15 years earlier. He spoke with measured calm, saying that this was not simply a matter of ownership but of a man's voice erased, his testimony ignored, his truth overwritten by convenience and manipulation. The silence in the room deepened as he spoke, for the weight of his words carried something beyond the technical. They carried the moral resonance of a man refusing to be erased in the same way his uncle had been. When Karen was called upon to respond, her composure wavered for the first time. She insisted the photograph was fabricated, her voice higher than before, her words rushing as though she could drown out the evidence with sheer force of will. She accused Luca of staging surveys, of conspiring with outsiders to attack her, and when the judge asked for documentation to support her claims, she produced nothing but the same flawed registry maps already in evidence. For a moment, her carefully maintained image of authority cracked, and the room could see not the composed homeowner but a woman desperate to hold on to something she had taken for granted too long. The judge's ruling, though delivered in the neutral tone of law, carried the force of finality. He declared that the evidence supported Luca's ownership of the driveway, that the garage had been built in encroachment, and that the county would be required to correct its digital records to reflect the proper boundary. Furthermore, Karen was ordered to remove the portion of the garage that stood over Luca's property and to compensate him for the costs of the independent survey and legal proceedings. As the words echoed through the courtroom, Luca felt not triumph but a profound exhaustion, as though he had carried a weight for so long that he had forgotten what it was to breathe freely. He glanced at Karen, who sat stiffly, her face pale, her eyes darting as if searching for some unseen path of escape, but the judgment had been spoken, and there was no longer a place for denial. Walking out of the courthouse into the cool afternoon, Luca felt the sun on his face, and for the first time since he had inherited the house, the driveway no longer seemed like contested ground, but like something solid beneath his feet, a piece of earth that had been returned to its rightful place. The battle had cost him months of strain, sleepless nights, and the erosion of trust in the systems meant to protect the truth. Yet in that moment he understood the deeper meaning of the struggle. It was not just about reclaiming property, but about refusing to yield to the slow suffocation of lies. He had stood his ground, and the ground had answered. The weeks after the ruling passed in a strange quiet, as though the neighborhood itself had paused to catch its breath after months of simmering hostility, and Luca found himself moving through the days with a tentative sense of relief that was tempered by the weight of everything the battle had cost him. The driveway, once a stage for confrontation, stood clear at last, its lines no longer obscured by barriers or planters or the looming shadow of Karen's garage, which soon bore the marks of demolition crews cutting into the structure she had fought so fiercely to defend. Watching from his porch, Luca felt no glee at the sight, only a muted recognition that justice often carried the face of loss, and though he had won, the victory carried the bitterness of knowing how easily truth could have been erased had he faltered for even a moment. Neighbors began to greet him again, some with cautious smiles, others with quiet nods, their silence an unspoken acknowledgement that they had watched the conflict unfold and chosen not to intervene. Karen, meanwhile, withdrew into herself, her once commanding presence replaced by a brittle absence. Curtains drawn, her voice no longer heard at meetings or on the street, her house already rumored to be up for sale. For Luca, the resolution was less about triumph than about reclaiming a fragile sense of belonging. He spent evenings repairing the garden his uncle had left neglected, repainting the shutters, clearing the garage of dusty boxes, and in these simple acts he felt the property slowly transform from a burden into a home. Yet he also carried the memory of sleepless nights, of letters ignored, of the thin line between security and dispossession, and he understood that what had happened here could happen again to anyone too weary or too isolated to fight. That knowledge hardened into a quiet resolve. He would guard this place not only as an inheritance but as a principle, a reminder that lines matter, that truth matters, even when bureaucracy and manipulation conspire to erase them. Standing at the end of his driveway one evening as the sun slipped low and cast long shadows across the pavement, Luca felt the stillness settle around him. Not the uneasy silence of siege, but the calm of something finally reclaimed, and in that moment, He knew he had not only defended a piece of ground, but honored the memory of the man who had first drawn its boundaries and refused to let them be forgotten.